Hey guys, tonight we begin with a cold stone room, a sleeping body, and one simple question. How did people in medieval castles get through the night without turning into decorative ice sculptures for the morning servants to discover? The fantasy version is easy. We imagine a grand chamber, a roaring fireplace, a soft bed, while snow falls politely outside the window. It is cozy, cinematic, and almost completely dishonest. A real castle was not a heated home. It was stone, timber, smoke, rank, labour, and wind, arranged into something that could defend a family, impress visitors, store supplies, shelter a household, and make everyone just uncomfortable enough to remember their place. The walls that looked so strong against enemies were also good at holding cold. The floors could bite through shoes, and a fire did not warm a castle the way a modern radiator warms a room. It warmed a circle. If you were outside that circle, history had very little sympathy for your toes. So, before we climb into the bed, gently like and subscribe if you enjoy these strange little journeys into ordinary survival. And tell me in the comments where you are listening from tonight, and what time it is there. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine arriving in a castle on a winter evening in late medieval Western Europe, perhaps in England or northern France, though details shift by place and century. The first thing you notice is not romance. It is thickness. Thick walls, thick doors, thick wool, thick smoke gathering in high places, thick silence beyond the firelight. Outside, the dark has already pressed itself against the stone. Inside, people are not trying to heat the whole building. That would be a losing battle. They are trying to create pockets of survivable warmth. This is the first modern illusion to lose. Medieval people were not usually sleeping in rooms that were warm by our standards. They were sleeping in layers of defence. A bed was not only furniture, it was a small weather system. The better beds of wealthier households might have mattresses filled with feathers or wool, linen sheets, heavy coverings, and curtains that could be drawn around the sleeper. Those curtains were not just pretty fabric for a historical drama. They trapped a little heat from the body and blocked some drafts. They also made privacy in a world where privacy was often something you hung on a rod and hoped no one pulled aside. For the highest ranking people in the castle, sleep could happen in a chamber set apart from the great hall, sometimes near a fireplace, sometimes protected by hangings, chests, servants, and layers of textile wealth. A noble bed was not merely softer, it was a declaration that cold itself could be negotiated by money, wool, fur, linen, down, timber, candlelight, servants carrying fuel, people airing bedding, people closing shutters before the worst of the night arrived. All of that stood between the sleeper and the stone. But the castle household was larger than the lord and lady. It included relatives, guests, officials, pages, guards, cooks, grooms, kitchen workers, messengers, and people whose names rarely survived because history preferred to write down the expensive bed and forget the person who hauled the wood. Many lower status sleepers had simpler bedding, shared spaces, and less control over where they lay down. Some might sleep in the hall after the main activities were done. Some slept near work areas, near animals, near doors, near stores, near places that made sense for duty rather than comfort. The closer your body was to service, the less likely the night belonged entirely to you. That is where the title becomes more interesting than a question about blankets. Nobody survived a medieval castle winter by one trick. They survived through a chain. The fire needed fuel. Fuel needed cutting, carting, storing, and rationing. A fireplace needed tending. A room needed shutters and hangings. A bed needed textiles. Textiles needed sheep, spinning, weaving, storage, repair, and cleaning. Warmth was not a button. Warmth was an economy. And in a castle, like most economies, it had a hierarchy. If you were important, warmth came toward you. Servants brought fuel. Servants prepared the chamber. Servants made sure the bedding was ready. The fire was watched. The clothes were placed where they could be reached in the morning, and the door did not sit open long enough to let winter walk in. If you were less important, warmth was something you chased, borrowed, shared, or waited for after other people had already taken the best of it. The Great Hall is a good place to feel this. In many castles and great houses, the hall was the centre of eating, gathering, receiving, judging, and household display. It might have a central hearth in earlier arrangements, later a fireplace, and a high roof where smoke and heat behaved rudely. After supper, after the noise thinned and benches shifted, that same hall could become a sleeping place for lower members of the household or visitors of lesser rank. The room that had displayed order by day now held bodies by night. Shared sleeping was common across many parts of medieval life. Beds could be shared by family members, servants, travellers, or people of the same household, depending on place, status, and circumstance. It was practical. Bodies make heat. Modern people often hear this and imagine awkwardness first, because we treat sleep as private property. But in a cold world with limited fuel and crowded households, privacy could be less urgent than not shivering until dawn. The past was not less intelligent than us. It was often solving a harsher problem with fewer tools. Even clothing carried some of the night's burden. People did not step into thin pyjamas and trust the thermostat like innocent fools of the modern age. Nightwear varied, and evidence is not always neat. But layers mattered. Linen next to the skin, wool above, caps, stockings, cloaks, blankets, and whatever was available could all become part of the sleeping system. A person rising in the dark might meet cold before they were fully awake. A medieval architecture had no interest in being gentle about it. Then there was damp. Cold air is one thing, damp cold is another. Stone can feel as if it has memory, as if every wet day it ever endured has remained inside it, waiting for your shoulder. Castles were not all bleak iceboxes, and some rooms were much more comfortable than the stereotype suggests, especially in wealthy households with good fireplaces, hangings, shutters, and bedding. But comfort was uneven. A chamber could be tolerable, while a stairwell felt hostile. A bed could be warm inside its curtains, while the basin beside it was cold to touch. A noble might complain about a draught. A servant might sleep in the draught and call that the arrangement. So the answer begins with this. People slept without freezing because they did not rely on the castle to become warm. They made smaller, warm worlds inside it. A fire circle. A curtained bed. A shared sleeping space. A woolen layer. A cap. A pallet away from the door if luck allowed it. A place near the embers if rank, duty, or timing permitted. The castle did not defeat winter. It negotiated with winter, room by room, body by body. And once you see that, the bed curtain stops being decoration. It becomes the whole story in miniature. A little wall of fabric inside a greater wall of stone, protecting one sleeper from a cold that everyone in the building knew, but not everyone was allowed to escape. That little wall of fabric mattered, because the larger wall of stone was never as obedient as it looked. A castle wall could be thick enough to stop arrows, patient enough to outlast rain, and proud enough to make a visitor feel small. But it could not promise a warm night. Stone did not care who owned it. It accepted cold from the air, kept it close, and returned it slowly to anyone foolish enough to sleep beside it without protection. So the medieval household learned to think in layers, not one solution, but many thin negotiations placed between skin and winter. A shutter over a window, a hanging on a wall, a rush-strewn floor, a wool blanket, a cap over the head, a dog curled near someone's feet. If the household allowed it, and the dog had not chosen a better political alliance near the kitchen, a chest set where a draught might pass, a servant closing a door quickly instead of standing there with a candle while all the expensive heat escaped like a prisoner with excellent timing. The window is a good place to begin, because medieval windows were often less friendly than modern imagination allows. In wealthy rooms there might be glazed windows, especially later in the Middle Ages, But glass was costly, fragile, and unevenly distributed. Elsewhere there were shutters, oiled cloth, horn, parchment, wooden screens, or openings that could be closed imperfectly. Light was welcome in the day. At night, the same opening became a small argument with the weather. A shutter could keep out wind, but it could not create summer. A narrow window reduced exposure, but it also reduced light. That is one reason castle rooms can feel so strange to modern eyes. Defensive needs, material limits, and comfort were always negotiating. The building wanted to protect. The body wanted warmth. The household wanted status. The smoke wanted to go somewhere inconvenient. Nobody got everything. Inside the better chambers, textiles softened this problem. Wall hangings were not only decoration, they could make a room look rich, tell stories, display taste, and impress visitors. But they also helped blunt the cold surface of stone. A bare wall makes a room feel colder than a covered one. Fabric does not perform miracles, but in a world without central heating, even a modest improvement mattered. If a hanging kept a wall from stealing quite so much warmth from the air around the bed, it had done honest work. This is where wealth becomes visible as temperature. A richer household could afford more textiles, better bedding, more fuel, more servants, and rooms arranged for comfort as well as ceremony. A poorer or more martial castle might have fewer soft defences against winter. Even within one castle, warmth was unevenly assigned. The Lord's chamber might have a fireplace, hangings, a curtained bed, and attendants. A lower servant might have a cloak, a pallet, and the ancient spiritual exercise known as trying not to complain where anyone important can hear. The bed itself was a piece of technology. Modern people often think of technology as metal, gears, wires, or engines. But a medieval bed with hangings, a raised frame, layered bedding, and curtains was also technology. It solved problems. Raising the sleeper off the floor helped avoid the coldest air, damp, vermin, and dirt. Curtains reduced drafts and held body heat. Thick covers preserved warmth. Shared sleeping added more heat. The whole thing turned the sleeper into the centre of a small insulated chamber. For elites, the bed could also be theatre. A great bed announced wealth before anyone slept in it. Carved wood, coloured cloth, fine linen, fur, and embroidered hangings could tell visitors that this household had resources to spare. But the practical and symbolic functions were not separate. In medieval life, useful things often had to look like rank, and ranked things still had to be useful. A beautiful bed that failed to keep its owner warm would be a very expensive insult. Lower down the household ladder, bedding could be much simpler. Straw mattresses or sacks filled with straw, chaff, or other materials appear in various medieval contexts, though exact arrangements differed. Straw was practical because it was available, replaceable, and insulating. It was also not romantic. It could compress, smell, collect pests, and remind the sleeper that the line between comfort and agriculture was sometimes thin enough to rustle. Rushes on floors worked in a similar world of practicality and unpleasant compromise. They could cover cold stone or beaten earth, absorb some mess, soften footfall, and make a room more usable. Fresh rushes might smell pleasant. Old rushes could become a record of everything the room had endured. In elite spaces, herbs and careful maintenance could improve matters, but the basic logic remained. Floors were cold, bodies were soft, and someone had to manage the distance between them. Night in a castle was also shaped by fire. But fire was never simple. A fireplace gave warmth, light, and a sense that the room was civilized rather than merely enclosed. Yet heat moved unevenly. Sit too far away and you received only the idea of warmth. Sit too close, and smoke, sparks, or roasting discomfort reminded you that medieval heating had personality. Fires required tending, and dying embers changed the room hour by hour. The chamber that felt almost gentle before sleep might become sharper after midnight. Fuel placed another limit on fantasy. Wood did not appear because a noble wanted atmosphere. It had to be cut, carried, dried, stored, guarded from waste, and distributed. In some regions and periods, fuel could be a serious expense. A large household consumed a great deal of it for heating, cooking, brewing, baking, washing, and lighting. Every log in the chamber had passed through labour before it became comfort. The sleeper closest to the fire was resting inside other people's work. That is why the castle's cold cannot be separated from its hierarchy. The building did not warm everyone equally, because the household did not value everyone equally. Rank determined space. Space determined proximity. Proximity determined heat. Even the act of closing a curtain around a bed created a boundary between those whose warmth could be enclosed and those whose warmth remained public, shared, or accidental. Some people slept because the room was prepared for them. Others slept because exhaustion finally won. A guard might doze in a cloak between duties. A kitchen worker might curl near residual heat after the fires had served dinner, if the rhythm of the household permitted it. A page, servant, or lesser retainer might sleep where supervision, need, and available space placed them. The evidence for these ordinary arrangements is often thinner than we want, because documents loved possessions more than tired bodies. Inventories list beds and textiles. They do not always pause to describe the person trying to keep warm under something much less impressive, and that silence matters. The richest beds survived in records because they were worth recording. The coldest sleepers often survived only as shadows around the objects they served. We can see the chamber. We can count the hangings. We can trace the fireplace. But the person waking before dawn with stiff fingers, careful not to disturb someone higher in rank, often remains just outside the written room. Still, the room gives them away. A castle at night was not one atmosphere. It was a map of unequal warmth, drawn by stone, fabric, fuel, and rank. The curtained bed held one small climate. The hearth held another. The floor near the door held another. The stair held another, colder one. And every body in the building knew, without needing a lecture, exactly where it had been placed on that map. The map was not drawn on parchment. It was drawn in habits. You learned it by watching who sat nearest the fire, who slept behind curtains, who waited until others had gone, and who understood that a closed door was not simply wood on hinges. It was permission. In a castle at night, doors mattered almost as much as blankets. A door could protect a chamber from drafts, but it also protected rank. The better rooms were not only warmer because they had thicker textiles or better hearths, they were warmer because fewer people were allowed to enter them. Every opening was a wound in the room's small climate. Every servant carrying water, fuel, bedding, candles, clothes, or messages had to pass through without wasting the heat gathered there. A careless pause could turn into a social mistake. Cold air entered quickly. Blame could enter even faster. This is why the first system layer behind castle sleep was movement. Who moved? Who stayed still? Who served? Who received? Who crossed the threshold? Who waited outside it? A modern bedroom is usually arranged around personal rest. A medieval elite chamber was arranged around rank, service, display, privacy, and control, with rest fitted carefully into the arrangement like one more valuable object. For a lord or lady, going to bed could involve other people. That sounds strange only because modern privacy has trained us to imagine sleep as a lonely rite. In a noble household, important bodies were attended bodies. Clothes had to be managed, bedding had to be arranged, candles had to be handled safely. The fire had to be watched, valuables had to be secured, doors had to be closed. Sometimes a servant might sleep nearby or in an adjoining space because the household did not stop needing service just because the most important person had decided to become horizontal. The bedchamber, then, was not simply intimate, it was administrative. The body of a powerful person required a small department. Warmth came with supervision. Comfort came with witnesses. Privacy, when it existed, was partial, negotiated, and often made by fabric rather than solitude. A bed curtain could hide a face, soften a draught, and make a symbolic inner room. But outside that cloth, the machinery of the household still breathed. For lower-ranking people, movement worked differently. They did not receive warmth as a prepared condition. They often produced it for others before seeking it for themselves. A kitchen fire might rage earlier in the evening, but the kitchen worker did not own that fire. A servant might carry logs to a chamber whose warmth they would not share. A guard might pass through freezing air so someone else could sleep under layered wool without worrying about the gate. The castle's warmth moved upward, carried by hands that were often cold. Fuel makes this very plain. A fire in a chamber looks personal, almost cozy, until you follow the wood backward. The log came from woodland, estate management, cutting, hauling, drying, stacking, accounting, and carrying. If the wood was damp, it smoked. If it was scarce, it had to be rationed. If too much was used, someone would notice. If too little was used, someone important might complain. In that small drama, the warmth of one room connects to the larger economy outside the walls. Castles did not float above the landscape. They consumed it. Woodlands, tenants, carts, animals, labourers, and household officers all sat invisibly behind the glow of a chamber fire. The listener sees flame, the historian should see supply, and the servant carrying an armful of wood up a stair probably saw something even simpler. Wait, those stairs deserve their own small complaint. Castle stairs could be narrow, cold, and dim, especially after sunset. Moving through them with a candle, a basket, bedding, or fuel was not a graceful cinematic glide. It was work. The wall brushed the shoulder. The air changed as one climbed. The sound of footsteps told people who was moving after dark. A castle at night was full of small noises. A latch, a cough, a dog shifting, a guard's step, a servant's breath, the dull answer of stone to a shoe. Noise mattered because rooms were connected by service. Heat was not only a physical condition, it was a schedule. Fires had to be lit or maintained at the right times. Bedding had to be ready before bodies arrived. Shutters had to be closed before wind made its case. Rushes, straw, and textiles had to be managed before they became unpleasant. A comfortable night depended on a sequence of tasks done early enough that the noble sleeper could experience them as if comfort were natural. That may be the quiet trick of wealth in any century. The richest comfort is the kind that hides the work that made it. A lord waking in the night might notice that the curtain held warmth around the bed. He might not think about the spinning, weaving, dyeing, purchasing, sewing, hanging, airing, beating, mending, and guarding of that fabric. A lady might appreciate the heavy coverlet without naming every sheep, field, worker, merchant, and servant folded into its weight. Comfort becomes most powerful when it feels like atmosphere instead of labour. But medieval people were not naive about labour. A household knew itself through service. Rank was performed every day in who touched what, who carried what, who slept where, and who could ask for more. If a chamber was too cold, the complaint did not float into the air. It travelled down the hierarchy until it found someone whose job it was to fix the problem, or at least be blamed near it. This does not mean elites were always deliciously warm and servants were always shivering in misery. History is rarely that neat. Some elite chambers were drafty. Some servants found better practical warmth near kitchens, stables, or shared sleeping spaces than an isolated room could offer. Some castles were better maintained than others. Some regions had different building habits. Some winters were harsher. Some households were richer, more crowded, more disciplined, or more chaotic. The point is not that comfort followed rank perfectly. The point is that rank gave a person more ways to command comfort when cold arrived. And cold always arrived somewhere. It slipped beneath doors, found loose shutters, entered stairwells, settled in unused rooms, and waited in the floor. It gathered where fires were not worth feeding. It waited where people slept because duty placed them there. It made the castle honest after dark. By daylight, banners, walls, and halls could perform power. At night, the body asked a more basic question: who gets to be warm without asking? The answer was never only architectural. It was social. A fireplace was a hole in the wall with status around it. A curtain was woven privacy. A blanket was stored labour. A closed door was permission made solid. A place near the fire was a small promotion. A place by the draught was a quiet verdict. So as the castle settled deeper into winter darkness, the old romantic picture kept losing pieces. The castle was not one grand shelter. It was many unequal shelters stacked inside each other. The stone protected everyone from the outside world in a broad, impressive way. But once the gate was closed and the night had entered the walls, protection became much more specific. It depended on which room you were in, which door you could close, which fabric belonged to you, which fire you were allowed to approach, and whether the household saw your cold as a problem worth solving. And for many people in the castle, the problem was not solved once, it was solved badly, repeatedly, with whatever the household allowed. Cold was not a single event before sleep, it was a series of small interruptions, the first touch of the floor, the breath that fogged slightly near a shutter, the blanket slipping from one shoulder, the dying fire changing the room without asking permission. The body noticed these things before the mind turned them into thought. A person waking in the middle of the night might not immediately know whether the sound was wind, timber settling, an animal moving below, or someone crossing the passage. But the body knew the temperature. It knew the difference between the warm hollow under the covers and the air beyond them. It knew that leaving the bed was not a neutral action. In a modern room, getting up is an inconvenience. In a cold castle, getting up could feel like an argument with the entire building. This made the edges of sleep important, not just sleep itself, but the moments before and after it. Before lying down, people tried to arrange the night in their favour. Clothes were kept close. Shoes or patterns might be placed where they could be found. A cloak could be folded within reach. A candle, if available and safe, had to be managed carefully, because fire was comfort until it became catastrophe. Bedding was tucked, curtains drawn, shutters checked, dogs moved or tolerated, and the body tucked itself into the smallest possible country of warmth. The phrase "going to bed" sounds simple. In this world, it could be a small domestic campaign. For a wealthier sleeper, the campaign had more equipment. The bed might stand raised from the floor, away from the worst damp and dirt. Curtains could be drawn on several sides. Heavy textiles could hang around the chamber. The fire might have been built up before bedtime, not to heat the whole room perfectly, but to push back the worst of the cold and dry the air a little. A servant might warm cloths, prepare bedding, or make sure the chamber was ready before the owner arrived. None of this made winter disappear. It made winter negotiable. For someone lower in the household, negotiation was more direct. A servant sleeping in a shared space had to work with crowding, timing, and fatigue. If the hall had warmth left in it, that warmth might be mixed with smoke, smells, old rushes, snoring bodies, and the social fact that the room was not truly private for anyone. The best place to sleep might not be the cleanest place, or the quietest place, or the safest place from being disturbed. It might simply be the place where the draught was weakest. The floor itself could become part of the story. Stone floors held cold with admirable commitment. Wooden floors could be kinder, but not magical. Rushes, mats, straw, boards, carpets, or cloth could create separation between the foot and the chill below. In wealthy rooms, layers made the cold less aggressive. In working areas, the solutions were rougher. The medieval household did not always ask whether something was comfortable. Often it asked whether it was better than nothing. And better than nothing was a very important historical category. A straw mattress was better than the floor. A wool cover was better than bare linen. A cloak was better than pride. A shared bed was better than freezing politely alone. A smoky fire was better than no fire, unless the smoke decided to win the argument. A shutter that rattled was better than an open hole. A curtain that did not fully stop a draught still gave the sleeper a small sense that the night had edges. This is one of the reasons medieval sleep can feel strange to imagine. It was not built around perfect comfort. It was built around reducing exposure. The goal was often not to become warm in the modern sense. The goal was to stop losing heat faster than the body could bear. That is a different relationship with the night. It is less about softness and more about containment. Containment shaped the castle from the largest scale to the smallest. The outer walls contained danger, the rooms contained rank, the bed curtains contained heat, the blankets contained the body. Each layer said the same thing in a different language: keep what you can inside, keep what you fear outside, and accept that the boundary will never be perfect. But boundaries needed maintenance. A curtain had to be cleaned or at least shaken, repaired, protected from damp, and kept from pests. Bedding had to be aired when possible, because trapped warmth and human use brought their own problems. Straw needed replacing. Wool absorbed smells. Linen required washing, which required water, labour, drying space, and weather that did not behave like an enemy. Even warmth created chores. That is the domestic reality hidden behind the cosy image. The medieval bed did not simply sit there, waiting to be admired. It demanded work. Someone had to fill or maintain the mattress. Someone had to mend fabric. Someone had to beat dust from hangings. Someone had to notice damp before it became rot. Someone had to keep vermin from turning the noble bed into a very expensive village. Comfort was not a purchase made once, it was a routine. The routine also had seasonal rhythm. In summer, a castle might feel fresh in places where thick stone resisted heat. In winter, the same thickness could become a cold companion. Autumn would bring its own preparations: fuel gathered, textiles repaired, storage checked, animals managed, food preserved, and household rhythms adjusted as daylight shrank. The night lengthened, and with it, the importance of everything that happened before the sleeping body entered the bed. For poorer households outside castles, winter preparations could be even more severe. But inside a castle, the scale made the system visible. A large household needed coordination. Where did the wood go? Which rooms deserved fires? Which fires served cooking? Which served work? Which served status? And which served actual bodily need? Who had the authority to demand more fuel? Who was expected to endure less? If a servant was cold, it might be unfortunate. If the lord was cold, it became a problem with administrative legs. The dark humour of the castle is that it could be both powerful and petty. It might command land, collect rents, store weapons, host important guests, and represent noble authority across miles of countryside. Yet at 3 a.m, all that power could narrow to a person under a blanket, trying not to let cold air touch the back of the neck. History loves grand walls. The body remembers the gap, and that gap is where sleep became honest. Not the painted version of medieval life, not the banquet hall, not the heroic tower against the moon, but the awkward, human moment when someone had to decide whether the need to rise was stronger than the desire to stay inside the tiny warm cave the blankets had made. The castle could protect a family name for generations, but it still could not make bare feet like a winter floor. The winter floor did not care whether the foot belonged to a lord, a lady, a servant, a child, or a visiting clerk who had misjudged how cold hospitality could become after midnight. But the household cared very much. That is the difference between weather and society. Weather touched everyone. Society decided whose discomfort deserved repair. Inside a castle, sleep was arranged through rank long before anyone closed their eyes. The highest-ranking people did not simply have better bedding, they had better control over interruption, space, service, and choice. A lord might sleep in a chamber where the fire had been prepared, where curtains could be drawn, where a servant knew what needed to happen without being told twice. A lady of the household might have attendants, textiles, chests of linen, and a room whose comfort also carried the pressure of being watched, managed, and expected to perform noble order, even in private life. That is an important complication. Elite warmth was real, but it was not the same as modern privacy. The better chamber could be warmer and still not be fully yours. People entered. Servants assisted. Family politics moved through doorways. Marriage, inheritance, illness, childbirth, visits, negotiations, and reputation all followed noble bodies into spaces we might imagine as personal. The curtain around the bed could soften the draft, but it did not remove the household. It made a smaller enclosure inside a world that still had claims on you. For women in noble households, The bedchamber could be a place of authority and vulnerability at the same time. It might be where keys, clothing, household textiles, letters, children, attendants, and intimate decisions gathered. It could be warmer than many other rooms, but it was also a room where rank had to be maintained. A great lady's comfort depended on labour, and her status required her to manage that labour. She might be shielded from cold by fabric and service, while also held inside a strict web of expectation. Warmth did not erase duty. It often made duty look graceful. Children complicate the room as well. Noble children were not always tucked into a modern nursery fantasy, safe and silent with little matching blankets. Their sleeping arrangements depended on age, status, household custom, wet nurses, attendance, education, and family politics. Some slept near caregivers, some were placed within household structures that trained them early to understand rank. A child could learn the castle's map of warmth before learning to name it. Who has a bed? Who shares? Who enters quietly? Who waits outside? Who is allowed to call for help? For servants, the lesson was sharper. Their sleeping places were often closer to duty than comfort. This does not mean every servant slept miserably every night. Some practical spaces could be warm in their own rough way, especially near kitchens, bakehouses, stables, or busy rooms where heat had been produced for work. But that warmth came with smells, noise, movement, animals, tools, or the chance of being summoned. It was not a chamber prepared for rest. It was rest fitted into the leftovers of work. A kitchen, for example, could be one of the warmer places in a castle complex. But warmth there was not gentle luxury. It was heat from labour, boiling, roasting, baking, carrying, cutting, washing, scrubbing, tending, and cleaning. The same fire that made a lord's meal might leave residual warmth after the household had eaten, but the people closest to it were also closest to smoke, grease, damp floors, heavy pots, and the relentless timing of food. Sleeping near warmth could mean sleeping near exhaustion's workplace. Guards and watchmen lived with another version of the problem. Their bodies protected other bodies' sleep. A castle's security did not pause because the bedding was comfortable upstairs. Someone had to watch gates, walls, passages, animals, stores, or entrances. Cold air loved these places. A guard on night duty did not experience winter as a decorative view from a narrow window. He experienced it as waiting, stamping feet, listening, adjusting a cloak, and knowing that too much comfort could become danger. If the people above slept behind curtains, someone below or outside helped make that sleep possible. Here the castle reveals a very old truth. Warmth is often guarded by cold people. That line sounds dramatic, but the mechanism is ordinary. The more important a sleeper was, the more the household worked to keep the night from reaching them. The less important a sleeper was, the more likely they were to meet the night directly. Rank did not abolish cold, it redistributed the struggle. Clothing showed the same pattern. Fine wool, fur linings, linen, caps, stockings, and layered garments protected bodies, but quality and quantity varied. An elite person might have more garments, more options, more storage, and more people to maintain them. A lower servant might own fewer layers and use them harder. Wet wool, worn shoes, patched hose, and a cloak doing the work of blanket and coat at once could turn sleep into another kind of thrift. The poor did not merely have less comfort, they had less margin for failure. Gender-shaped labour around warmth too. Textile work, laundering, mending, airing, storing, and household management often involved women. Their exact roles varied by status and household. The beautiful curtain around a noble bed was not just a purchase. It belonged to a chain of skilled and repetitive work: spinning, weaving, sewing, repairing, folding, carrying, cleaning, and protecting from damp or pests. A bed looked still when the room was quiet, but behind its stillness was motion, much of it done by hands that records mention only when they belonged to someone important. Even guests entered this hierarchy. Hospitality was a serious social obligation. But not every guest received the same comfort. A high-ranking visitor might be given a better chamber, better bedding, better access to fire, and more careful attention. A lesser retainer, messenger, or traveller might be placed where space allowed. Sharing a bed or room was not necessarily insulting, it could be normal, but placement still spoke. In a castle, where you slept, told you how the household read your value. That value could change with circumstance. A sick person might need warmth more urgently. A pregnant woman, a recovering child, an elderly relative, or a favoured guest could alter household arrangements. But again, need did not automatically produce care equally. Care had to pass through rank, resources, custom, affection, obligation, and availability. A cold night exposed not only architecture, but relationships. The church also hovered quietly over medieval sleep, though not always in dramatic ways. Night could carry prayers, fears, habits of modesty, ideas about vulnerability, and the rhythm of religious time. Bells, offices, saints' days, fasting seasons, and moral expectations shaped daily life. Sleep was bodily, but the body was never just biological in the medieval imagination. It belonged to God, household, lineage, labour, and reputation. Even the simple act of undressing for bed lived inside a world of modesty, service, and social meaning. So by the time the room darkened, sleep had already been sorted. The castle had taken the same winter and divided it into many experiences. For one person, cold was a draught to be corrected. For another, it was the normal air around duty. For one, the bed curtain was a soft wall. For another, the wall was stone, and the stone was close. For one, warmth arrived through a servant's hands. For another, warmth was what remained after those hands had finished serving. The floor still waited for everyone in the morning, but not everyone met it from the same height, under the same blanket, or with the same right to complain. And the right to complain may be the most revealing kind of blanket in the whole castle. A complaint is not only a sound, it is a social privilege. To say, "This room is too cold," and expect the household to respond is already to occupy a place where your discomfort has weight. Someone hears it, someone repeats it, someone fetches wood, checks the shutter, shakes the bedding, moves a screen, or quietly blames the person who should have noticed earlier. For a lower servant, the same sentence might go nowhere. The room is cold because rooms are cold. The floor is hard because floors are hard. The draught comes through because the draught has always come through. And if you are lucky, you learn which corner is least cruel before the old hands take it. That is the hidden rule of castle warmth. Comfort was not simply found, it was authorised. Authorisation could be obvious, like a private chamber with a fireplace. It could also be subtle, like permission to remain near a fire after work, permission to use an extra cover, permission to sleep in a less exposed place, or permission not to rise when another person called. The night was full of small permissions. Who may close the door? Who may ask for a candle? Who may take the better side of the bed? Who may wake someone else because the fire has burned low? Who may pretend not to hear? These questions do not sound grand, but they are how hierarchy enters the bones. Fuel sat at the centre of this hidden rule. Wood was warmth, but it was also accounting. A castle household could burn astonishing amounts of fuel across kitchens, bakehouses, brewhouses, halls, chambers, workshops, and service spaces. Supplies had to last. Waste mattered. Bad weather could make transport harder. Damp wood could turn comfort into smoke. A fire in one room meant labour and material had been directed there instead of somewhere else. So when a chamber fire burned for an important sleeper, it represented more than kindness. It represented allocation. The household had decided that this body, in this room, at this hour, deserved a controlled share of the landscape outside. Trees became heat. Labour became flame. Estate management became a warmer blanket over one shoulder. This is why medieval cold was never purely natural. Winter came from the sky, but warmth came through institutions. A tenant might owe labour, a woodman might cut, a carter might haul, a servant might carry, a chamberlain or household officer might decide or supervise, a cook might guard fuel for the kitchen because dinner was not optional, a noble might expect a fire because rank had trained expectation into the body. By the time sparks rose in the hearth, the flame had already passed through a chain of authority. The fireplace itself made that chain visible inside the room. In earlier castles and halls, central hearths had sent smoke upward through roofs or openings, with all the inconvenience that implies. Later fireplaces and chimneys improved domestic comfort, though unevenly and gradually. A wall fireplace could localize heat, make some rooms more livable, and create a stronger sense of private chamber comfort. But it also created new distinctions. A room with a fireplace was different from a room without one. A bed near one was different from a pallet far away. Architecture began sorting cold with greater precision, yet even a fireplace had limits that a modern listener should feel clearly. Heat did not spread obediently through stone corridors. It did not fill every tower stair and service passage with mercy. Rooms with high ceilings could lose warmth upward. Drafts could undo careful work. Smoke could misbehave. A fire might make one side of the body too warm and the other side too cold. A compromise the Middle Ages offered with a straight face. This made the placement of furniture practical as well as symbolic. Beds could be positioned away from direct drafts when space allowed. Chests, screens, hangings, and furniture could break air movement. Curtains could transform the bed from an exposed platform into a fabric enclosure. Even the act of turning a bed so that its occupant faced a certain direction might matter if the room had a difficult window or a temperamental door. Medieval people did not need thermometers to understand airflow. They had ankles. The ankles were excellent witnesses. They knew which threshold leaked. They knew which stair held cold. They knew when a fire had become decorative rather than useful. They knew the difference between wool that had been dried properly and wool that carried yesterday's damp like a grudge. They knew that a bed warmed by bodies was easier to enter if someone else had already suffered the first chill. They knew that the person who arrived last might find the outside edge. Shared sleeping, again, belongs inside this practical world. In many medieval households, people shared beds or sleeping spaces for reasons of economy, warmth, custom, and space. It was normal in many contexts, and it solved real problems. A shared bed could conserve heat. It could also reflect status, age, gender expectations, household roles, travel conditions, or lack of alternatives. The important point is that sleep was often social before it was private. That social quality could be comforting. A crowded hall might be noisy, but it was not isolated. Bodies nearby could mean warmth, safety, familiarity, and the dull human reassurance that the night had not swallowed everyone separately. But crowding could also mean smells, disturbance, exposure, quarrels, and the simple misery of not controlling your own rest. The medieval solution to cold often borrowed from the body beside you, and that meant the body beside you also borrowed from your patients. In the higher chamber, the bed curtain performed a more elegant version of the same thing. It gathered breath, warmth, and privacy into a small enclosure. It did not create modern solitude, it created managed separation. Outside the curtain there might be servants, a spouse, a child, a chest, a coffer, a sleeping attendant, a banked fire, and the entire pressure of the household. Inside the curtain, the sleeper received a little pocket of air made warmer by fabric and human heat. It was not freedom from the castle. It was a smaller castle inside the castle. That smaller castle had its own border. Pull the curtain, and the room changed. The bed became less visible. The draught softened. The person inside became important enough to be enclosed. It is a simple gesture, almost nothing. Cloth moving on rings or cords, a hand drawing fabric across an opening. But in that gesture you can see the whole system. Material becomes boundary. Boundary becomes privacy. Privacy becomes warmth. Warmth becomes rank. For people without that boundary, the night remained more public. A servant sleeping in a hall or service area could not transform space so completely. Their sleeping body stayed closer to the common air, the common noise, the common interruption. Even when they found warmth, it was often warmth without enclosure. The fire was shared, the floor was shared, the room was shared. The morning's work was already waiting. And so the hidden mechanism of surviving a castle winter was not simply that medieval people were tougher, though they were certainly accustomed to discomforts many of us would greet with legal action. It was that they lived inside a system that made cold manageable by dividing it. Some cold was blocked with stone, some with shutters, some with fire, some with wool, some with bed curtains, some with other bodies, some with obedience, some with silence. The castle did not remove winter. It taught everyone where their winter was supposed to be endured. And once winter had been assigned, it shaped behaviour long before anyone admitted it. People arranged themselves around cold the way a court arranged itself around rank. They made choices that looked ordinary on the surface, but were really responses to the invisible pressure of temperature. Where to sit, when to rise, how long to keep a door open, whether to share a bed, whether to sleep in clothes that were uncomfortable but useful, whether to endure smoke because smoke at least meant fire had not abandoned the room. The consequences began in the evening, when the castle changed its character. By daylight, the building was busy, loud, and full of hierarchy. Meals, work, visitors, animals, repairs, messages, prayers, accounts, and orders moved through it. But as night gathered, the castle narrowed. People withdrew from open spaces into smaller ones. Fires became more important. Candles became more precious. Doors closed. The large public building broke into little islands of warmth and attention. Not every island lasted until morning. A fire that looked generous at supper might be only embers by the deep hours of the night. Someone could bank it carefully, covering coals so they might survive, or feed it before sleep if fuel and rank allowed. But keeping a fire alive required material, judgment, and sometimes a waking body. In the richer chamber, that waking body might belong to a servant. In a common space, it might belong to whoever was nearest, least asleep, or most responsible. The warmth of sleepers could depend on the sleeplessness of someone else. This creates one of the quietest consequences of castle cold. Rest was not equally protected. The important sleeper was shielded from interruption. The servant, guard, nurse, or attendant could become the interruption, absorbing the night. A child wakes, a fire drops, a dog barks, a draught worries the curtain. A person of rank stirs. The castle's comfort system depended on people whose sleep could be broken without the event becoming important enough to remember. The records rarely say, Agnes was tired because she had crossed the passage 3 times in the cold. They may list cloth, wax, firewood, repairs, payments, offices and provisions. They may preserve the great bed, the chamber, the hearth, the hanging, the cost. But fatigue itself often disappears. This is why domestic history has to listen to objects carefully. A closed shutter tells us someone closed it. A maintained fire tells us someone tended it. Clean bedding tells us someone handled it in daylight, so someone else could disappear into it at night. Even sleep posture could be shaped by cold. People curled, tucked, huddled, drew covers tight, kept caps on, and protected the most vulnerable parts of the body. The head loses heat quickly, and a nightcap or hood was not a comic accessory invented for nursery illustrations. It was practical. In a world where the air outside the covers could be sharp, covering the head made sense. Medieval people did not need modern physiology to know when their ears were suffering. The body made its own instructions. Keep the neck covered. Keep the feet from the floor. Do not let the coverlet slide. Do not breathe too much cold air through the opening in the curtain if you can help it. Do not leave the warm hollow unless the need is urgent. If sharing a bed, negotiate without words. Elbows, knees, turns. Blanket ownership. A sleeping person can become a feudal lord of fabric. That joke works because the problem is recognizable. Cold makes people selfish in small ways. It also makes households cooperative in small ways. Shared warmth required trust, tolerance, and habit. A hall full of sleeping bodies was not elegant, but it could be effective. People knew the sounds of others nearby. They knew who snored, who shifted, who got up before dawn, who had to be left alone, who might steal a better place if given the chance. The medieval night was not silent privacy. It was social weather. Animals sometimes belonged to that weather too. Dogs, cats, horses, and livestock occupied castle life in practical ways, though not all in the same rooms or under the same rules. A dog near a fire could be companion, guard, nuisance, or living foot warmer. Stables and byres held their own warmth from animals, straw, and enclosed bodies, but they also carried smell, labour, and mess. People who worked near animals knew that warmth and cleanliness were not always allies. In winter, the warmest place might be the place your nose had strong opinions about. Cold also affected morning. The first person awake did not merely begin a day, they disturbed a temperature. A door opened, and a room lost what it had gathered. A fire had to be revived. Clothes stiff with chill had to be put on. Water might be unpleasantly cold, and washing, when it happened, required practical decisions about timing, heat, and modesty. The day began with the body leaving its little defended enclosure and entering the castle's larger climate again. For servants, morning could arrive before warmth did. Fires for kitchens, halls, and chambers had to be prepared. The household's visible life depended on invisible early motion. Someone rose into the cold so others could wake into a world already made usable. This is one of the strongest differences between being served and serving. The served person experiences preparation as background. The servant experiences preparation as cold air on the face before dawn. This early labour was not merely unpleasant, it protected order. If fires were late, meals were late. If meals were late, tempers changed. If important rooms were cold, authority noticed. If bedding was damp, complaints travelled. In a large household, small failures became social events. A winter morning could turn a missing log, a careless shutter, or a smoky hearth into evidence of poor management. Cold was physical, but it produced blame. That blame did not fall randomly. It followed the same hierarchy as warmth. The person with authority did not blame the weather first. Weather was too large and too innocent. It was easier to blame the chamber staff, the keeper of fuel, the person responsible for shutters, the servant who left the door open, the worker who failed to dry wood properly, or the unlucky human being nearest the problem when someone important became cold. In this way, temperature became discipline. The castle trained bodies through this discipline. Servants learned speed at thresholds. Guards learned endurance at posts. Children learned that rank could be felt in blankets. Ladies and lords learned expectation. Guests learned their place by bedding. Workers learned which fires were theirs to tend and which were not theirs to enjoy. Everyone learned that cold was natural, but the response to cold was political. And this is where the old question, how did they sleep without freezing, begins to change shape. The answer is not that medieval people had one magical method. It is that they lived in a culture of constant adjustment. They accepted discomfort that would scandalize us, yes, but they also fought it with intelligence. Fire, fabric, straw, shutters, shared bodies, room placement, and careful conservation of heat. The cost was that the fight never ended. A cold castle did not offer one dramatic battle with winter. It offered 1,000 small ones, most of them too ordinary to be recorded. A latch closed quickly, a curtain pulled tight, a hand carrying wood, a child tucked closer, a servant rising first, a guard stamping life back into his feet, a noble sleeper turning under heavy covers, never quite knowing how many people and objects stood between that bed and the night outside. And the deeper the night became, the more that question shifted. At first, it seemed to be about warmth. Who had enough blankets, enough fire, enough wool, enough straw between the body and the stone? But somewhere in the long dark hours, warmth became only the first layer. The greater privilege was not simply being warm, it was being allowed to stay asleep. A castle was full of people whose sleep had conditions attached to it. A guard could sleep only when relieved. A servant could sleep only after the tasks were done, and sometimes not even then if someone called. A nurse, attendant, page, kitchen worker, porter, groom, or messenger might lie down, knowing that rest could be interrupted by duty. Their bodies might be tired enough to collapse, but their sleep did not fully belong to them. For the people higher up the household, sleep could be protected by other people's wakefulness. That is, the midpoint of the whole castle night. The real luxury was not a bed with curtains. The real luxury was a bed with curtains and a world outside those curtains, arranged so you did not have to hear everything, answer everything, or rise for everything. Warmth kept the body alive. Protected sleep kept rank comfortable. This changes the meaning of the bed curtain again. Earlier, it was a device against drafts. Then it became a sign of status. Now it becomes something more private and more unsettling. A filter. It filtered cold, yes, but also noise, service, obligation, and the sight of labour. Inside the curtain, the night could feel softened. Outside it, the castle was still working. The embers did not watch themselves. Doors did not decide to close. Candles did not become safe by intention. A chamber did not remain orderly because order was natural. Somewhere beyond the curtain, someone had to understand the room's needs before the sleeper became aware of them. That is a quiet kind of power, to have discomfort intercepted before it reaches consciousness. Think of a winter hour after midnight. The hall has gone low and dim. The fire there is no longer the heart of a gathering, only a red memory under ash. A servant wakes because something in the room has changed. Perhaps the cold has sharpened. Perhaps a draught has shifted. Perhaps a person of status has stirred. There is no dramatic scene, no great speech, just a body leaving one poor pocket of warmth to protect a better one elsewhere. The candle is guarded by a hand. The door is opened only as much as needed. The passage breathes cold. The servant crosses it quickly, because cold air follows like a dog with bad manners. In the chamber, the work is small. Touch the fire, adjust a covering, check that the shutter has not loosened, make sure nothing dangerous is too near the flame. Then back out, if no one has fully woken, as if comfort has maintained itself. That invisibility is the point. In a well-run household, elite comfort could look effortless precisely because effort had been moved out of sight. The lord or lady might remember a decent night. The servant might remember the corridor. This is not to turn every noble sleeper into a villain or every servant into a silent martyr. People lived inside the assumptions of their time. Many nobles took household responsibility seriously. Many servants found pride, security, food, community, and advancement within service, depending on household and position. A large castle could be harsh, but it could also be a place of belonging, compared with the insecurity beyond its walls. History becomes false when it turns everyone into a monster or a victim, but it also becomes false when it pretends comfort was neutral. The castle's night was an arrangement, and arrangements have beneficiaries. Someone got the chamber. Someone got the pallet. Someone got the fire. Someone got the smoky edge of the hall. Someone got the right to sleep through a problem. Someone else became the answer to that problem. The household officers knew this in practical terms. A chamberlain, steward, marshal, cook, porter, or other office holder, depending on the size and structure of the household, helped keep the noble machine functioning. The warmth of one bed might depend on the smoothness of accounts, stores, duties, and discipline. It is easy to separate domestic comfort from administration, but medieval households did not make that separation so cleanly. To keep people fed, housed, warm, ranked, and ready was governance at the scale of rooms. A castle was not just a building, it was a schedule made of people. That schedule told the fire when to be lit. the doors when to be barred, the food when to appear, the horses when to be tended, the beds when to be prepared, and the lower bodies when to wake before the higher ones. Even sleep had a timetable. The night was not empty. It was organised darkness. And organised darkness made the difference between surviving cold and being crushed by it. Without routine, a castle could become chaos very quickly. Smoke in the wrong place, wet bedding, empty wood stores, a door left unbarred, a sick child unattended, a kitchen fire delayed, a guest insulted by poor lodging, a guard asleep at the wrong hour. Cold exposed weak management because cold turned small failures into bodily facts. That is why castle sleep has to be understood as a system rather than a scene. A scene gives us the bed, the fireplace, the snow outside. A system gives us the servant waking early, the woodland cut months before, the woman mending a coverlet, the guard losing feeling in his fingers, the page learning not to stand in a doorway, the guest reading his status in the weight of the bedding, and the noble body inside the curtain, warmed by a structure it may never fully see. The question is no longer simply, how did people sleep without freezing? It is, how did a household decide which bodies must fight the cold directly and which bodies could be protected from knowing the fight was happening? That question carries us into the second half of the night with a different kind of light. The fire is still important. The wool is still important. The curtains are still important. But now they are no longer just survival tools. They are evidence. They show where labour collected, where rank settled, where care was permitted, and where endurance was expected. By the deepest hour before dawn, the castle becomes almost readable. The warmest spaces are not random. The coldest spaces are not accidents. They follow use, status, work, and access. A person could move through that building and feel the social order through temperature alone. Chamber, passage, hall, stair, kitchen, gate, stable, wall walk. Each place had its own version of winter. Each version belonged to someone. And still, people slept. Not perfectly. Not always comfortably. Not in the uninterrupted modern fantasy of 8 peaceful hours under a duvet while a thermostat performs invisible miracles. They slept because exhaustion is persuasive, because bodies adapt, because routines hold, because wool works, because embers last, because people share warmth, because servants move, because guards watch, because curtains close, because human beings are astonishingly good at making a small shelter inside a larger problem. The castle did not give them comfort equally. It gave them a nightly lesson in who could be protected from the cold and who had to become part of the protection. And becoming part of the protection changed how people understood the building itself. A castle looked like shelter from the outside, from a distance, with its towers and walls. It promised safety in the most obvious language medieval architecture possessed. Height, thickness, enclosure, threat. It said, "Come inside. The world beyond the ditch and gate is worse." But once inside, especially in winter, the same building taught a more complicated lesson. Protection from one danger could create exposure to another. The walls that stopped violence also trapped smoke. The narrow windows that reduced vulnerability also limited light and let in drafts when their closures failed. The towers that watched the landscape could be bitterly cold. The passages that helped movement also carried air like little rivers. The stone that made the castle impressive could make a room feel as if winter had taken up permanent residence in the masonry and was paying no rent. This is the deeper contradiction of castle sleep. The castle was built to resist the outside world, yet the outside world still entered through temperature, damp, darkness, and labour. You could close the gate against an enemy. You could not close the gate against January, and January did not arrive politely. It came as wet wood that smoked instead of burned cleanly. It came as a shutter that rattled just enough to ruin sleep. It came as condensation, damp clothing, chilled bedding, stiff fingers, and the unpleasant discovery that a chamber could be prestigious without being kind. The medieval castle was not a modern home wearing old stone. It was a defensive household, trying to become domestic without ceasing to be defensive. That tension shaped rooms. A hall needed to gather people, display authority, host meals, receive guests, and sometimes shelter sleepers. A chamber needed to provide rest, privacy, status, storage, service, and access. A kitchen needed to produce heat and food at a scale that made the whole household possible. A gatehouse needed to watch and control movement. A chapel needed reverence. A stair needed to fit inside walls designed with defence and structure in mind, not with the comfort of a sleepy servant carrying a candle as its primary concern. So no room was merely a room. Each one was a compromise between purpose and body. The body wanted warmth. The institution wanted order. The architecture wanted strength. The household wanted display. The weather wanted to humiliate everyone. This is why a castle could contain strange contrasts. A private chamber might be warmer than the hall, but more politically charged. A kitchen might be warmer than a noble room at certain hours, but full of heat that belonged to work rather than rest. A stable might hold animal warmth, but also smell, damp straw, and labour. A guardroom might have a fire, but also interruption and responsibility. A bed might be soft, but the room around it could remain sharp. Comfort did not sit in one place. It flickered. For people moving through the castle, this flickering created a bodily knowledge of the building. They knew the cold stair. They knew the passage where wind entered from some crack or badly fitting door. They knew which fireplace smoked. They knew which walls stayed damp after rain. They knew which room became tolerable only after many bodies had occupied it for a while. They knew where to stand without being obvious, where to warm hands without stealing too much notice, where to sleep if one was allowed a choice at all. That knowledge rarely entered formal records because it was too ordinary. No one needed to write down that the Northwest Passage was hateful in winter if everyone who used it already knew. But ordinary knowledge is often the strongest kind. It lives in posture and timing. A servant takes a faster route. A child avoids a cold corner. A guard chooses the side of a doorway that catches less wind. A lady's attendant places a garment close to the bed because the first moment after rising is always the worst. A page learns not to linger with the door open because the room will punish him before the household does. The building trained them all. It trained people to conserve heat, to respect thresholds, to value fabric, to notice smoke, to move quickly through cold spaces, to share warmth when rank allowed it, to tolerate smells when warmth required it, and to accept that comfort was not a steady condition. Comfort arrived in patches. It had to be defended. This helps explain why medieval interiors could be so textile-rich among the wealthy. Modern minimalism would have died in a draft. Fabric was not clutter. It was insulation, display, softness, colour, sound dampening, privacy, and portable architecture. A hanging could make a wall less cruel. A carpet or covering could make a floor less punishing. A curtain could turn a bed into a chamber. A cloak could become a blanket. A blanket could become a wall. In a cold castle, cloth was not secondary to architecture. Cloth completed architecture, but cloth also wore out. It trapped smells, absorbed damp, attracted pests, needed repair, and required storage. The more comfortable the room, the more maintenance it demanded. This is another contradiction. The things that made sleep possible also created work that made other people tired. Every soft layer had a rough history attached to it, and the same can be said of fire. Fire comforted, but fire threatened. Sparks could leap, candles could fall, embers could revive in the wrong place. Smoke could irritate lungs and eyes. A badly managed hearth could turn a room from cold to dangerous. Medieval households understood fire as both friend and liability. To sleep near warmth was to trust not only flame, but the people and customs that kept flame under control. That trust was practical, not sentimental. It depended on routine. Bank the coals, watch the candle, keep cloth away from danger, close the shutter, do not block the smoke path, bring dry fuel if dry fuel can be had, wake if something smells wrong. A castle slept safely only because many small acts had been repeated until they became almost invisible. This is where the romance of the castle becomes thinner, but the people become more impressive. They were not living inside our fantasy and failing to meet our standards. They were living inside a difficult material world and making it work through habit, hierarchy, and attention. Their solutions were imperfect because their problem was relentless. They did not need one grand invention. They needed 1,000 ordinary defences that could be performed every night without ceremony. And because those defences were ordinary, they shaped memory less than battles, marriages, sieges, and inheritances. We remember the tower. We remember the lord. We remember the banner. We forget the latch closed against the wind. We forget the wool cap. We forget the hand that pulled a bed curtain before the room lost its heat. We forget the person who woke early enough to make cold less visible to someone else. The castle, then, was never simply warm or cold. It was a machine for sorting exposure. It could shelter many people from the weather outside, but inside its walls, it continued to distribute smaller weathers. The warm pocket, the smoky corner, the damp stair, the privileged chamber, the crowded hall, the watch post where the night seemed to have teeth. To sleep there was to live inside those divisions, and to understand them not as theory, but as air on the skin. Air on the skin could tell a truth that rank tried to polish away. The warmer place was not always the better place. The colder place was not always the more dangerous one. In a castle, comfort came with trade-offs, and the body learned to make bargains that modern comfort has made us forget. A kitchen could be warm, but it was not peaceful. Heat lived there in its working clothes. It came with smoke, steam, grease, damp cloth, wet floors, sharp tools, heavy pots, scullery noise, and the smell of yesterday refusing to leave politely. A person sleeping near that world might be warmer than someone in a passage, but the warmth did not arrive wrapped in dignity. It arrived with work still breathing beside it. The same was true of stables and animal spaces. Enclosed animals create heat. Straw insulates. A stable could feel more forgiving than a stone stair, especially in bitter weather. But warmth there was braided with smell, manure, insects when the season allowed them, restless animals, damp, and the constant knowledge that comfort had borrowed its strength from livestock. If a groom or worker found rest near that warmth, it was practical, not pastoral. The horse did not become a decorative medieval radiator. It remained a large animal with opinions. Even shared sleeping, useful as it was, carried costs. Another body gave heat, but also movement, breath, noise, and social negotiation. A shared bed could be ordinary, sensible, even reassuring. It could also mean less choice about who disturbed you, who pulled the covering, who brought in damp clothing, who smelled of work, smoke, animals, or ale, and who decided their elbow had inherited half the mattress by divine right. Warmth did not always come with serenity. Often it came with company. For elites, the costs were different. A private chamber could be warmer and more controlled, but it also demanded performance. The bed was not just where a person disappeared from the world, it could be where rank continued in a quieter costume. Servants might enter, attendants might sleep nearby. Visitors might be received in chamber spaces depending on custom and status. Illness, childbirth, marriage, family negotiation, and household authority could all gather near the bed. The more important the body, the more carefully surrounded it was, and the less completely alone it might be. So even the privileged bed curtain was not a perfect escape. It created a pocket of warmth and privacy, but also made visible the fact that privacy had to be manufactured. A modern bedroom door says, "This is mine." A medieval curtain said something more delicate. For this moment, within this cloth, let the room pretend not to see. The hidden cost of castle warmth, then, was that nobody received pure comfort. The powerful received managed comfort, Watched comfort, serviced comfort, comfort that required resources and people. The lower household received leftover warmth, shared warmth, noisy warmth, smoky warmth, warmth that came attached to labour. The castle did not offer one clean answer to cold. It offered many imperfect bargains, each fitted to status and circumstance. Weather made these bargains sharper. A mild winter night might let the whole system seem adequate. A hard frost exposed every weakness. Damp wood smoked. Old shutters failed. Poorly dried bedding became miserable. A room that was tolerable in autumn became cruel in January. The gap under a door, almost charming in summer, became a small betrayal. The body kept accounts that no steward wrote down. Illness could change the bargain as well. A feverish person, an older relative, a recovering woman, a child, or someone weakened by labour might need warmth more urgently. But need and entitlement were not the same thing. A household might respond with care, especially for valued family members or important dependents, yet resources and rank still shaped the response. The person who most needed the warmest place was not always the person allowed to occupy it. That is one of the colder truths in the story. Survival systems can be intelligent and unjust at the same time. Medieval households knew many practical ways to reduce cold. They used fuel, cloth, shared bodies, architecture, bedding, routine, and attention. But those methods moved through social order. The problem was not lack of cleverness. The problem was that cleverness served hierarchy first. There were exceptions, because life always ruins a clean argument. In moments of crisis, households could become more flexible. A sick servant might be allowed nearer warmth. A beloved nurse might receive care. A child might be tucked where rank alone would not explain it. A harsh lord might neglect comfort where a practical steward improved it. A poorer castle might share hardship more evenly, simply because there was less to divide. An unusually well-managed household might make winter less brutal for many people. The past was not a diagram. It was people improvising inside rules. But exceptions do not erase the rule. They reveal how much depended on judgment. A castle was not warmed by technology alone. It was warmed by decisions. Who receives fuel? Who gets bedding? Who repairs the shutter? Who waits? Who wakes? Who is believed when they say they are cold? At every level, winter forced the household to show what it valued. The most important costs were not always dramatic. They were accumulative. A night of broken sleep, a morning begun too cold, a blanket never quite thick enough, a damp sleeve, a cough made worse by smoke, a stiff back from a poor palate, a servant slower in the morning because the body never fully rested. Medieval people endured a great deal, but endurance is not the same as absence of cost. A body can become accustomed to discomfort and still be shaped by it. This is where the story should resist exaggeration. We should not imagine everyone in every castle trembling every night on the edge of death. Many people managed. Many slept well enough. Wealthy households could be surprisingly comfortable in the rooms that mattered most. Fireplaces, hangings, feather beds, wool coverings, and careful service could create real coziness. Medieval people laughed, rested, loved, dreamed, and complained like people in any century. They were not tragic props arranged around a fireplace. But we should also resist the opposite fantasy, the one that turns a castle into a charming bed and breakfast with weaponry. Their comfort was fragile by our standards. It depended on labour that could fail, fuel that could run low, textiles that could dampen, smoke that could thicken, and social rules that decided whose discomfort counted. A castle winter was not a single misery. It was a test of maintenance. And maintenance has a moral history. The polished chamber remembers the hands that polished it, if we choose to look. The curtained bed remembers the people outside the curtain. The fire remembers the woodcutter, the carrier, the servant, the person who woke to stir the coals. The warmest place in the castle was never just a location. It was the visible tip of an invisible chain. By late night, that chain lay across the building in silence. In one room, a sleeper turned within thick covers and barely woke. In another, someone shifted on straw and searched for the least cold part of the floor. Near the kitchen, heat lingered with the smell of labour. Near the gate, cold pressed harder because duty opened toward the outside. The castle held all of them at once, and the old walls made no explanation. They simply kept standing, while human bodies negotiated the price of being inside. The price of being inside was paid in small bodily currencies. Not always in catastrophe, more often in stiffness, smoke in the throat, sleep broken into pieces, damp cloth against the skin, a shoulder aching from the edge of a pallet, feet that never quite warmed before morning called them back to work. These are not the kinds of details that usually decide a dynasty, so they rarely stand in the centre of the record, but they decide how a day feels. They decide how quickly a servant moves, how patiently a guard waits, how sharply a child cries, how long a person can keep being useful before exhaustion begins to speak through the body. A castle household depended on useful bodies. It needed hands before dawn, backs strong enough to carry, eyes awake enough to watch, knees willing to climb stairs, lungs prepared to tolerate smoke, and tempers disciplined enough not to turn cold into open complaint. The human cost of castle sleep was not only that some people slept less warmly, it was that imperfect sleep returned to the daylight as labour. A kitchen worker who had slept badly still had fires to manage. A groom still had animals. A guard still had a post. A chamber servant still had to enter quietly, move carefully, and make someone else's morning appear civilised. There was no modern language of burnout waiting to protect them. There was duty, custom, necessity, and the knowledge that the household would continue whether the body felt ready or not. Smoke is part of that cost. Fire gave warmth, but it also gave irritation, soot, smell, and risk. In better designed spaces with chimneys, smoke could be managed more effectively, but medieval heating was not universally clean or predictable. A smoky hall, a temperamental hearth, damp wood, or poor draught could make the very thing that preserved warmth also disturb breathing and sleep. People adapted. They did not necessarily experience every smoky room as disaster, but adaptation is not magic. Eyes water, throats scratch, hair and clothing hold the smell. Bedding gathers the memory of the room. Damp added another quiet burden. A castle might be strong against assault and still lose arguments with moisture. Rain, groundwater, condensation. Wet clothing, damp straw, and poorly dried textiles could all change the quality of sleep. Damp cold sinks deeper than dry cold. It makes fabric feel heavier, makes a mattress less inviting, and makes the morning seem to begin inside the bones. In elite chambers, better textiles, airing, fires, and service could reduce the problem. In less favoured spaces, damp could become part of the room's personality. The body responds to damp and cold by tightening. Shoulders rise, hands tuck into sleeves. Feet seek each other. Sleep becomes curled rather than open. A person might wake in the same position in which they fell asleep, not because it was comfortable, but because movement would break the little heat that had been earned. That kind of sleep restores, but incompletely. It gives enough rest to continue, not enough to feel free. For children, the cost could be confusing before it was understood. A child in a noble household might be protected by caregivers, bedding, and proximity to status, yet still learn fear of dark corridors, dislike of cold floors, and the rule that adults do not always come when comfort is wanted. A lower status child in service, depending on age and role, could learn even earlier that tiredness was no excuse from tasks. The medieval household was a school long before it was a workplace. It taught through routine, and winter was one of its stricter teachers. For women doing household textile work or managing domestic stores, the cost of warmth extended into daylight. Bedding did not maintain itself. Linen did not wash, dry, fold, or store itself. Wool did not mend itself. Curtains did not shake out their own dust. Straw did not replace itself politely. In elite spaces, the finished effect might look still and graceful, a bed ready, a chamber ordered, fabric hanging where it should, but the stillness was manufactured by motion. Someone's hands had made the bed into a small climate. Illness made all of this more serious. Cold did not cause every sickness medieval people feared, and we should not turn winter into a simple villain for every cough. Medieval medical ideas were different from modern medicine, and people explained bodily trouble through frameworks of humours, air, balance, divine meaning, habit, and experience. But even without modern theory, people knew that being cold, damp, exhausted, and smoky did not help a weak body. A person already ill, very young, very old, or worn down by labour could suffer more from a bad sleeping place than a stronger person might. This is one reason warmth became care. To give someone the better bed, the better covering, the place closer to heat, or the right not to be disturbed was not only practical, it was a judgment about value, affection, obligation, and future usefulness. Care inside a castle was rarely separate from hierarchy, but it was still care. A nurse keeping a child warm, an attendant adjusting a lady's bedding, a servant letting another take the less drafty edge, a cook allowing someone to linger near residual heat after work. These small mercies rarely become famous, but they were part of survival too. That matters because a purely grim picture would be false. People were not only oppressed by their rooms, they made jokes, shared tricks, argued over blankets, learned which places were tolerable, and developed the deep practical intelligence that comes from living close to materials. They knew when wool was useful, when straw needed changing, when a shutter should be wedged, when a fire had to be left alone, when a door must be closed fast, when another person was too cold to ignore. The castle was hard, but its people were not passive. Still, intelligence does not erase unequal cost. It only shows how much effort was required to make the night survivable. The human cost lay in the constant attention demanded by comfort. A modern sleeper delegates warmth to machines and forgets about it. A medieval castle household delegated warmth to people, habits, fuel, cloth, and social order. Forgetting was dangerous. Someone had to remember. By the hours before dawn, that remembering became heaviest. The air had cooled. Fires were low. The deepest sleepers remained hidden in their cloth enclosures, while lighter sleepers heard the castle begin to stir. A servant's foot touched the floor. A guard shifted at the gate. A kitchen worker moved toward the first tasks of morning. Somewhere, bedding held the last warmth of the night, and somewhere else, a person left warmth behind because the household required motion. This is the human underside of the castle's winter survival. Not endless suffering, not romantic toughness, not a simple story of people being stronger than us. A colder truth, and a more useful one. Comfort was made by bodies that could not always keep it for themselves. The night did not simply test whether people had enough blankets. It tested how much work a household could place between one sleeper and the cold, and how many other sleepers had to carry that work into morning. That morning is where the evidence becomes both helpful and evasive. It gives us things: beds, accounts, fireplaces, inventories, rooms, repairs, payments for fuel, references to chambers, lists of textiles, household roles, and the stubborn remains of stone. It gives us less of what we want most: the exact feeling of a servant waking cold, the private complaint of a noblewoman whose chamber smoked, the joke someone made when a shared blanket became a battlefield, the little human phrases that would make the night complete. This is why any honest history of castle sleep has to move carefully. We can say with confidence that medieval castle households used fire, bedding, textiles, clothing, shutters, room arrangement, and shared sleeping to manage cold. We can say that wealth and rank strongly shaped access to better beds, better rooms, more fuel, and more service. We can say that bed hangings and curtains mattered not only for display and privacy, but also for warmth. We can say that great halls, chambers, kitchens, service rooms, stables, passages, and guard spaces created very different sleeping conditions within the same castle complex. But we should not pretend every castle worked the same way. A 12th century fortress, a 14th century noble residence, a royal castle, a border stronghold, and a fortified manor could differ enormously. England was not France. France was not the Holy Roman Empire. And a damp Atlantic winter was not the same as a colder inland climate or a milder southern one. Even within one region, money changed everything. A wealthy household with good stores, many servants, and well-furnished chambers could make winter sleep far more comfortable than a smaller, poorer, or more military establishment. The records also favour the rich. This is not because the poor had no lives worth recording. It is because expensive objects attract writing. A fine bed might appear in an inventory because it had value. Tapestries, coverlets, sheets, feather beds, furs, chests, curtains and hangings could be counted, inherited, transported, repaired, pawned or displayed. The poorer sleeping place, the borrowed cloak, the worn pallet, the spot near residual kitchen heat, or the servant's improvised solution often left fewer traces. History looks into the best bedroom first, because the best bedroom left receipts. This creates a danger for storytelling. If we follow only the surviving objects, we might accidentally turn elite arrangements into universal medieval life. We would see the curtained bed and imagine everyone tucked into some version of it. That would be wrong. If we follow only the hardship, we might flatten the past into misery and miss the real comfort that wealthy households could create. That would also be wrong. The truth sits in the variation. Medieval people were neither helpless victims of cold nor secretly modern hotel guests in fur-lined rooms. They lived across a wide spectrum of arrangements, and the spectrum itself is the point. Archaeology helps, but it does not answer every question. A fireplace tells us heat was intended for a space, but not exactly how warm that space felt at 3 in the morning. A window opening tells us about light, air, defense, and design, but not whether the shutter rattled on a particular night. A chamber layout can suggest privacy and hierarchy, but it cannot always tell us who slept there when the household was crowded with guests. Stone survives, breath does not. Images can help too, but medieval images are not photographs. Manuscript illuminations, paintings, and carvings may show beds, curtains, clothing, fires, and domestic scenes, but they often compress symbol, status, convention, and idealized order. They tell us what people recognized as meaningful, not always exactly what happened in every room. A beautiful bed in an image is evidence, but it is evidence with manners. It has dressed itself for the occasion. Written sources have their own manners. Household accounts may be wonderfully practical, listing fuel, repairs, food, cloth, wages, and purchases. Inventories can reveal what a household owned. Wills and legal documents can show the value of bedding and textiles. Literary sources may describe chambers, beds, or cold in vivid ways, but each source speaks from a position. The account book cares about expense. The inventory cares about property. The poem cares about meaning. The chronicler often cares about rank, morality, or politics. None of them was waiting patiently to answer a modern YouTube title about freezing at night. So the script has to reconstruct without pretending to overhear too much. We can enter the room through objects, routines, and material constraints. We can show that a curtain held warmth because that is practical. We can show that fuel required labour because large households consumed resources. We can show that rank shaped rooms because medieval households were openly hierarchical. But we should avoid inventing exact conversations, exact temperatures, exact bedtime rituals, or a universal night routine that every castle followed. The past becomes more trustworthy when we leave some of its doors only partly open. There are popular myths to avoid as well. One myth says medieval people were simply filthy, stupid, and numb to discomfort. That is lazy. They understood cold intimately and developed practical ways to handle it. Another myth says castles were impossibly freezing all the time, which ignores seasonal variation, wealthy interiors, fires, textiles, and the adaptability of daily life. A third myth, almost the opposite, imagines cosy stone rooms warmed perfectly by roaring fireplaces, as if the Middle Ages were a theme hotel with better helmets. That one is charming, but the walls would like a word. The careful answer is better than the dramatic one. People in medieval castles survived cold nights through layered, unequal, labour-intensive systems. They heated bodies more than buildings. They trapped warmth in beds rather than warming every corridor. They used cloth as insulation, fire as a local defence, shutters as imperfect barriers, shared sleeping as practical heat, and hierarchy as the organising principle of comfort. Some people slept quite well. Some slept badly. Many slept well enough to continue. That phrase, well enough to continue, is probably closer to the truth than either romance or horror. It respects the fact that medieval people lived full lives inside conditions we would find harsh, without turning their endurance into a circus. It also respects the fact that comfort existed, but often depended on someone else's effort. The evidence does not let us hear every shiver. It does let us see the system that decided where shivering was most likely to happen. And if the sources sometimes fall silent around the coldest sleepers, that silence does not mean they were absent. It means the archive stood nearer the curtained bed than the drafty floor. The task is not to fill that silence with invented drama. It is to notice its shape, to let the objects speak carefully, and to understand that every warm chamber in the record casts a shadow behind it. That shadow followed the castle long after the fires went out. It followed the rooms into inventories, repairs, ruins, paintings, restorations, novels, films, and the soft modern habit of looking at stone and imagining comfort where there was often only endurance arranged beautifully. We inherit castles mostly as images: a tower at sunset, a hall with banners, a bed with curtains, a fireplace large enough to roast something heroic. The cold is harder to inherit because cold does not survive as neatly as masonry. A ruin can keep a wall for centuries and lose the nightly work that made the wall livable. It can keep a fireplace and lose the person who carried wood to it. It can keep a window opening and lose the shutter, the draught, the hand pulling cloth closer at 3 a.m. It can keep the shape of a chamber and lose the smell of smoke in wool, the dull ache of rising before dawn, the quiet irritation of a servant told to close a door more quickly. When we visit castles now, we often walk through the evidence after the discomfort has evaporated. Tourism has its own weather. The day is usually bright enough. The path is marked. The floor is safe. The gift shop is warm. A guide may point to a fireplace, and the modern mind completes the scene with coziness. But the medieval room was not designed for our imagination's convenience. That fireplace did not make the whole building kind. That high ceiling did not help the person trying to conserve heat under covers. That beautiful window, if closed badly or covered imperfectly, could be a small winter argument every night. This is why modern restoration can mislead, even when it is careful. A furnished chamber with a handsome bed and glowing light can help us understand status, craft, and atmosphere. It can also smooth away the maintenance. The room appears still, the bed appears ready, the fabric appears clean, the fire appears picturesque. What disappears is the schedule: airing bedding, drying cloth, carrying fuel, replacing straw, managing smoke, closing shutters, waking early, and negotiating who had the right to occupy the warmest place. Modern comfort has trained us to think of warmth as background. You enter a room and expect the air itself to serve you. You do not usually ask who carried the heat there. Because heat comes invisibly, through pipes, wires, ducts, fuel systems, electric grids, boilers, and bills paid somewhere off-screen. In that sense, we are not so different from the noble sleeper behind the curtain. We too live inside comfort systems we rarely see until they fail. That is the modern echo hidden in the medieval castle. The castle makes the labour visible because the system was still close to the body. Wood had weight. Wool had smell. Bedding had hands behind it. Doors had to be shut by someone. A fire was not an icon on a thermostat, It was flame, smoke, ash, fuel, risk, and attention. Medieval warmth was personal in a way modern warmth tries not to be. It had faces attached, and because it had faces attached, it exposed social order more plainly. When a modern heating system works, everyone in a house may share the same air, though wealth still decides who has better insulation, better housing, better energy security, and fewer hard choices. In a castle, warmth was less evenly hidden. It gathered around the bed of rank, the kitchen of labour, the hall of gathering, the stable of animals, the post of duty. The body could read the building like a document. The warm place told you something. The cold place told you something too. This is why the romantic castle image is not useless. It is simply incomplete. The bed curtain was beautiful. The fire was real. The wall hangings could be gorgeous. The chamber could feel safe, impressive, even deeply comfortable by medieval standards. Human beings have always made beauty inside difficulty, and we should not strip that away in the name of seriousness. A candlelit chamber with heavy fabric and a banked fire may genuinely have felt like relief after a wet road, a noisy hall, or a freezing passage. But beauty did not cancel the structure beneath it. The same curtain that gave warmth also marked separation. The same fire that gave comfort also required fuel. The same chamber that created privacy also needed servants crossing thresholds. The same castle that promised shelter also distributed cold according to use and rank. The romance becomes richer, not poorer, when we let it keep its shadows. The old castles that survive today often stand empty of the household that made them work, without servants, animals, smoke, stores, bedding, rushes, repairs, accounts, children, guests, guards, and winter routines. A castle becomes architecture without metabolism. It has bones, but not breath. Medieval people lived inside the breath, warm, smoky, damp, crowded, anxious, resourceful, tired, and occasionally cozy in ways that were all the more precious because they had to be made. Perhaps that is why the question keeps pulling at us. How did they sleep without freezing? We ask it because the castle looks solid, and sleep looks vulnerable. Stone seems permanent. A sleeping body seems temporary and soft. The contrast is almost tender. We want to know how human warmth survived inside a building that appears to belong more to weather, war, and inheritance than to dreams. The answer, by now, has become less like a trick and more like a pattern. They survived by refusing to let the room be the whole shelter. They built shelter closer to the skin. They wrapped it around the bed, gathered it in wool, shared it with other bodies, fed it with wood, guarded it with shutters, carried it through service, and ranked it according to the household's idea of importance. They made warmth portable, social, and uneven. And we remember the wrong part first. We remember the castle as the shelter, but for many sleepers, the real shelter was smaller: the curtain, the cloak, the straw, the body beside them, the last coal under ash, the one corner where the wind did not enter so sharply. The castle was the grand container. Survival happened in the little containers inside it. That changes how a ruin feels. A bare chamber is no longer simply empty. It is missing its softer walls. It is missing the fabric that made stone bearable, the bedding that lifted bodies from the floor, the smoke that proved the fire was doing something, the footsteps that protected someone else's sleep, the ordinary irritation of people trying to keep heat where heat wanted to leave. The modern visitor sees a room. The medieval sleeper felt a negotiation, and the negotiation did not end when the sleeper understood it. It continued every night, because winter was patient. A person might learn the best corner of a hall, the least cruel side of a shared bed, the way to fold a cloak so it covered the feet without exposing the shoulder, the hour when a chamber fire became more memory than heat. But knowledge did not abolish cold. It only made cold more manageable. That is the final insight beginning to form inside the castle walls. Medieval people slept through winter, not because they had defeated discomfort, and not because they were magically tougher than modern bodies. They slept because they had built a culture of management around an unavoidable condition. The castle did not promise comfort, it promised layers of response. The first response was architectural. Thick walls, enclosed rooms, shutters, fireplaces, hearths, and the separation of spaces all shaped how the household met winter. But architecture was blunt. It could block wind, hold a roof over heads, and create defensible shelter, yet it could not follow the body into sleep. For that, the household needed smaller tools. The second response was textile. Wool, linen, fur, hangings, coverlets, curtains, straw-filled bedding, mattresses, cloaks, caps, and floor coverings did what stone could not. They moved closer to the skin. They softened surfaces. They trapped breath and heat. They made temporary rooms inside permanent rooms. They turned the bed into a shelter that could travel no farther than its frame, but inside that frame could become the difference between misery and rest. The third response was social. People shared beds, shared rooms, shared fires, shared routines, and shared responsibility, though never equally. The household itself became part of the heating system. The ranking of people, the assignment of rooms, the timing of work, the right to call, the duty to rise, the permission to remain asleep. All of these helps decide how cold moved through the building. Warmth was physical, but its path was social. The fourth response was memory. Not written memory, necessarily, but bodily memory. People remembered where the draft came from. They remembered which covering worked, which door must be closed fast, which fire smoked, which servant knew the chamber, which child kicked off blankets, which guest complained, which winter had been worse. Survival lived in these small lessons. A castle household was an archive of repeated nights. And because these responses were layered, they could fail at different points. A strong wall could still hold a cold room. A good fire could still meet damp wood. A fine bed could still need someone to maintain it. A servant could still oversleep. A shutter could still loosen. A blanket could still slip. The medieval night was not one problem with one answer. It was a chain, and every link mattered. This gives the castle a different kind of drama than the one it usually receives. The common drama is siege, battle, inheritance, betrayal, banners against the sky. Those things mattered, of course, but the quieter drama happened when nothing historic seemed to be happening at all. A chamber was made ready, a hall emptied, a guard took his place, a kitchen fire lowered, a curtain closed, a person entered sleep, trusting that enough of the chain would hold until morning. There is something deeply human in that. Every age has its own version of trusting the chain. We trust switches, pipes, walls, wages, weather reports, locks, furnaces, blankets, and the hidden labour of people we may never see. Medieval castle sleepers trusted things closer to hand: ash-covered embers, wool weight, familiar footsteps, a door latch, the body beside them, the servant who knew when to enter, the guard who stayed awake, the wood that had dried properly, the curtain that did not leave too wide a gap. The difference is that their chain was harder to ignore. Its pieces were visible, audible, and sometimes irritating. A modern room hides its systems behind walls. A medieval castle often left them in the open, smoke on beams, wood by the hearth, hangings against stone, straw under bedding, servants in motion, animals below, stairs cold enough to make every errand memorable. Comfort had not yet become invisible. It was still a thing people touched, carried, mended, fed, and guarded. This is why the question should leave us with respect rather than simple pity. It would be easy to imagine medieval people as trapped inside cold stone, huddling helplessly while the modern viewer feels superior beneath electric heat. That would miss their skill. They knew materials. They knew routines. They knew how to make a small enclosure warmer than the room around it. They knew when to use bodies, fabric, fire, straw, and timing. They understood the castle not as a postcard, but as a living problem. But respect should not become romance. Their skill existed because the conditions demanded it. Their bodies paid for mistakes. Their comfort depended on wealth, rank, season, weather, and the labour of others. A noble bed could be ingenious and unequal at the same time. A hall could be communal and uncomfortable at the same time. A kitchen could be warm and exhausting at the same time. That double vision is the honest one. The bed curtain still holds the story best. Imagine it now, after everything else has become visible. At first, it seemed like decoration. Then it became insulation. Then privacy. Then rank. Then labour. Then evidence. Now it becomes a question made of cloth. What must exist outside this curtain so that the person inside can sleep? Outside it, there is stone. There is weather. There is wood cut somewhere beyond the walls. There are sheep, flax, dye, thread, needles, chests, accounts, keys, servants, stairs, shutters, ash, smoke, tired hands, and rules about who may cross which threshold. There are people close enough to serve and far enough not to disturb. There are bodies whose cold has been made normal, so another body's cold can be treated as a problem. Inside it, there is not perfect warmth. There is only a better bargain. The air is still cool. The fire may be fading. The mattress may settle. The sleeper may hear a sound from the hall. But compared with the passage, the floor, the gate, or the smoky edge of the kitchen, this small enclosed bed is a triumph. Not a modern triumph, a medieval one, fragile, laborious, unequal, and real. So when dawn approaches, the castle is not simply waking from sleep, it is revealing what sleep required. The first grey light touches stone that has held cold all night. It finds the curtain still drawn, the ashes low, the rushes flattened, the cloaks stiff, the servants moving, the guards tired, the bedding warm only where bodies have been. The building has survived another night. So have the people inside it. But survival is not the same as comfort, and comfort is not the same as justice. That is the insight the castle leaves behind before the final morning fully arrives. The question was never only how people avoided freezing. It was how a whole household turned winter into a hierarchy of shelter, and how quietly that hierarchy could be mistaken for home. Home is the word that makes the castle dangerous in memory. It softens the stone too quickly. It invites us to imagine belonging before we have asked who belonged fully, who belonged conditionally, and who belonged only as long as work could still be taken from them. For some people inside the walls, the castle really was home, the place of family, lineage, childhood, authority, meals, prayers, stories, quarrels, and sleep. For others, it was the place where home and workplace could not be separated, where the same building that sheltered the body also claimed its hours. That is why the final morning should not arrive with a grand explanation. It should arrive quietly, the way mornings did, not all at once, but through little betrayals of darkness. A line of grey at the window, the fire gone low, a foot testing the floor, a cough from the hall, a servant moving before the room is ready to admit that night has ended. Somewhere, a sleeper inside curtains lingers in the last warm air gathered by the bed. Somewhere else, a person rises from straw, cloak, pallet, bench, or shared space, and steps directly into the cold that has been waiting. The castle has done its work, but not evenly. It has kept the worst of the outside world beyond the wall, It has protected stores, people, animals, records, weapons, honor, and sleep. But inside that protection, the night has still sorted everyone. It has left some bodies rested enough, some merely functional, some stiff, some smoky, some already moving toward the labor that will rebuild warmth for the next evening. This is the part of history that refuses to become a clean picture. A castle could be impressive, intelligent, beautiful, and harsh in the same breath. Its people could be practical, affectionate, irritable, proud, exhausted, generous, and unfair without needing to fit into one simple moral. The same household could contain care and inequality. The same fire could be mercy and privilege. The same bed curtain could be comfort and border. By now, that curtain has become less like an object and more like a witness. It has watched the whole night. It has held heat close to one body. It has hidden sleep from the room. It has turned cloth into a wall, and a wall into a statement. It says that medieval comfort did not begin with warming the castle. It began with drawing a smaller line around the person who mattered enough to be enclosed. Outside the curtain, morning belongs first to work. Ash has to be handled. Fuel has to be brought. Clothing has to be shaken or warmed if possible. Bedding has to be straightened, aired, guarded, or repaired. Doors open, drafts return. The hall becomes public again. The kitchen gathers heat not for rest, but for bread, broth, ale, meat, servants' meals, nobles' meals, and the long machinery of appetite. The gate wakes into duty. The stable wakes into smell and motion. The passages wake into footsteps. The castle becomes day again, and day is very good at disguising night. People dress. Rank reappears more clearly. The lord is the lord. The lady is the lady. The servant is the servant. The guard is the guard. The child is taught. The guest is served. And the building resumes its official face. The cold night is absorbed into routine. A bad sleep becomes slower hands. A smoky room becomes a cough. A warmer chamber becomes the expectation that tomorrow should be managed just as well. This is how endurance becomes invisible. When a system works just enough, people stop calling it survival. They call it normal. The medieval castle did not need every sleeper to be comfortable. It needed enough people to keep functioning, enough rest to work, enough warmth to avoid disaster, enough hierarchy to decide where resources went, enough habit to repeat the whole arrangement again after sunset. And yet we should not end by taking all coziness away from them. That would be another kind of falsehood. There were real, gentle moments. A child tucked closer, a dog warming feet near a hearth, a shared laugh under too little blanket, a chamber made genuinely peaceful by fabric, fire, and care. A servant finding a tolerable place near fading heat. A noble sleeper grateful for a curtain against the draught. Human beings do not wait for perfect conditions before making tenderness. They make it in the gap between discomforts. So perhaps the best answer to the title is not one answer at all, but a change in how we imagine warmth. People in medieval castles avoided freezing because they lived within layers: stone against the weather, fire against the room, cloth against the stone, bedding against the air, bodies against one another, labour against disorder, rank against equality, habit against fear. Each layer helped. Each layer had a cost. Each layer tells us something about the world that made it necessary. The modern fantasy wants the castle to be either miserable or magical. The truth is more useful. It was a place where warmth had to be made, protected, rationed, performed, and carried. It was a place where the grandest wall could still leave a person cold, and the humblest blanket could become architecture. It was a place where comfort was not simply owned, but produced every day by people whose names were often less carefully preserved than the cloth they maintained. When we leave the castle now, we should leave it with both images at once: the great wall against the winter field, and the small curtain around the bed. The wall is what history likes to show us. The curtain is what the sleeping body understood. Between them lies the real story. Not a romantic fortress glowing with effortless warmth, not a frozen prison of endless suffering, but a household machine where survival was stitched, carried, burned, shared, and assigned. Dawn keeps spreading over the stone. The chamber grows pale. The curtain, if it is still drawn, no longer looks theatrical. It looks tired. It has done its small work through the night, holding back what it could and failing where cloth must fail. Beyond it, the cold has not vanished. It has only changed shifts. It moves from the bed to the floor, from the floor to the passage, from the passage to the hands that open doors and feed fires. And somewhere in that first grey light, before the castle becomes impressive again, the truth is plain enough to touch. Medieval people did not sleep warm because castles were warm. They slept warm when enough walls, fires, fabrics, bodies, servants, habits, and permissions gathered around them before the cold could get in. Warmth was not the castle. Warmth was the small defended space the castle allowed someone to keep.